A single order Blair refused to withdraw sends quiet ripples through Locked-up, leaving Hamish Macbeth to navigate stubborn pride and rising tension. In this village, standing your ground can be just as dangerous as backing down. Where in the world are you listening from tonight? And if you enjoy settling into these Highland mysteries, subscribe and make this part of your nightly ritual. Only 11% are subscribed while 89% aren't. Your support truly means a lot. The rain came in thin, sharp needles that worked their way into Hamish's collar as he stood by the hotel drive and watched the lorry grind up the last rise. Lugs pressed against his leg, unhappy with the noise, and Sonsie skulked under a gorse bush as if she meant to bite the tyres. Hamish felt much the same. Nothing good ever came to Loch-Two wrapped in grand promises, and this cask was meant to be grander than most. Folk had talked about it for a week, as if Whisky could save a village in winter. Priscilla stood near the steps, a clipboard tucked under her arm. She wore a neat coat that made Hamish feel scruffy, which he was. She nodded at him but did not smile. The hotel manager, Johnson, fussed at her elbow, muttering about insurance and signatures as if he were arranging a royal visit. The porter hovered beside the lorry, smelling of cheap whisky. Hamish wondered if Johnson could smell it too, but the man was too busy wringing his own hands. The driver jumped down from the cab, a heavy man with a tired face. He avoided Hamish's eyes, which put him off at once. A frayed rope hung from the side of the load. When Sonsie strutted past, tail high, the driver gave a small kick in her direction. "Filthy brute," he muttered. Hamish caught the movement, filed it away, and said nothing. Some men liked kicking animals. It did not make them interesting. The cask itself was rolled down a ramp with far too much ceremony. Johnson followed it like a terrier, babbling about tourists, journalists, and bookings already made for Hogmanay. Priscilla looked at Hamish as if she expected something from him. "You'll keep an eye on it, Macbeth," she said. It was neither a question nor a request. It was the sort of line that pushed him into trouble. "Aye, I'll look in," Hamish said. He wished he had not. It only meant she could blame him later. Inside the hotel, heat struck him after the wet air. The tourists had begun to gather early. Hamish heard snatches of talk about rare whisky, Highland charm, and clean air, none of which existed in the way they imagined. He stood by the peat fire for a moment. Lugs lay at his feet, soaking the rug. Sonsie sat on a chair as if she owned the place until the porter shooed her off. A crofter named Donal, already nursing a pint, nodded at Hamish. "Saw a strange car at the back last night," he said. "Dark thing. English plates, might be nothing." Hamish shrugged it off. "Some lost Glaswegian," he said, though even he knew that made no sense. He was tired of every scrap of gossip being pushed at him before anything had happened. Lugs gave him a reproachful look, as if even the dog knew he had been lazy. Mist curled in from the loch as the night deepened. The hotel bar grew warmer and louder. A pair of tourists argued about which whisky region was superior, though neither of them could tell one dram from the next. Hamish stayed by the fire, restless. He did not trust the porter. He did not trust the rope. He did not trust anything to do with the cask, but he also did not want to be responsible for it. Near midnight, the bar door slammed open and Johnson stumbled in, pale as unbaked bread. His hair stuck to his forehead. He gripped the edge of the counter. "It's gone," he whispered, before repeating himself louder. "It's gone. The New Year cask. The bung's out, the floor's soaked, and it's nearly empty." Someone swore. Someone else laughed, thinking it a joke. Priscilla went rigid. A journalist lifted his head like a fox scenting a henhouse. Hamish felt the weight of the moment as if the whole room leaned on him. "Show me," he said. They walked to the cellar. The damp smell hit him first. A dark stain ran along the floorboards to the drain. The cask sat like a dead animal, useless now. Johnson wrung his hands again. "I locked the door. I swear it. This is ruin. We'll lose everything. They'll think we're thieves." Priscilla said nothing. Her silence was worse than blame. Hamish crouched by the cask. He found nothing clever, only wet wood and the faint smell of seaweed where it did not belong. Sonsie slipped in behind them, tail twitching, and Lugs whined as if he sensed a storm. "Who had keys?" Hamish asked. "Just me," Johnson said, "and the night porter, and, well, the assistant, but she wouldn't—" Hamish raised a hand. He didn't want names yet. He didn't trust his own judgment tonight. He stood slowly, aware of Priscilla watching him. She looked at him the way someone looked at a wobbly table, useful until it collapsed. "Folk will talk," Johnson said. "They'll say we wasted it, or sold it, or drank it." "They'll talk anyway," Hamish said. "They always do." When they returned to the bar, the gossip had already begun. A tourist asked loudly if the Highlands always lost valuable goods. Someone from the village muttered something about careless management. Donal said he heard the hotel had never insured the cask properly. Another man said the police in Loch Dhu were too soft for real crime. Hamish felt the heat rise in his face, lugs pressed against his leg again. Sonsie jumped onto a chair near the door, glaring at anyone who looked her way. Hamish almost envied her. A cat never had to explain anything. "Macbeth," Priscilla said quietly. "This cannot become a scandal." He had no answer for her. Outside, the rain had eased to a steady drizzle. Sonsie slipped past him into the dark, vanishing like smoke. Lugg stayed close, unhappy. Hamish stood in the cold for a moment, the hotel lights behind him and the heavy silence of the loch before him. He did not know who had taken the whisky. He only knew the village would blame him if he failed, and Strathbane would blame him if he succeeded in the wrong way. It was the usual position he found himself in. The drizzle thickened. A gull cried somewhere over the water. Hamish pulled his coat tighter, though it did nothing to warm him, and walked back toward the station with Luggs trotting at his heels. The night felt stretched thin, as if something else waited just beyond the dark. The morning crawled in with a raw, grey light that did nothing to improve the mood in Loch Dhu. Hamish Macbeth knew trouble was already spreading before he even left the station. Luggs paced back and forth, whining in a fretful sort of way, while Sonsie crouched on top of the filing cabinet as if she meant to attack the next thing that moved. Hamish felt much the same. The whisky theft had barely happened, and already he could sense the village sharpening its gossip like knives. He stepped outside into a cold wind that slapped at his face. The road was slick with old rain, the sky the colour of dishwater. A day like this made even honest folk grumble. He headed for Patel's shop, because that was where lies and rumours usually hatched first. Luggs trotted beside him, ears low. Sonsie stalked ahead for a few yards, then vanished behind a garden wall, no doubt plotting more havoc. At least she was out of sight. People behaved slightly better when she wasn't staring at them with those wild eyes. The bell above Patel's door gave a sharp ring when Hamish entered. A couple of tourists hovered near the magazines. One woman with a scarf knotted too tightly around her neck turned to her companion. "I heard the cat did it," she whispered. "Some wild thing knocked it over. They say there's a vicious creature roaming about." Mrs. Patel pretended to tidy the counter, her expression keen. "That beast of Macbeth's," she said, loud enough for everyone. "Wouldn't surprise me." Her tone was prim, but she enjoyed herself. She always did when Hamish was in bother. Hamish took a slow breath. "Sonsie didna drink £20,000 worth of whisky," he said. Even to his own ears he sounded defensive, which annoyed him further. The tourist blinked. "Oh, you're the policeman?" "Aye," Hamish said. "Sadly." Miss Patel sniffed. "Folks saw scratch marks, deep ones. Big creature could have done that." Hamish wondered who the liar was, because he'd seen no such thing. "Someone's imaginations had more whisky than the cask," he said. "It was theft, not a cat." But the damage was done. The tourist studied him with too much curiosity, as if he and Sonsie were part of some local circus. When he left the shop, two schoolboys ran past, yelling, "Watch out! Macbeth's monster's aboot!" He would have ignored them, but one added, "Maybe he trained it to steal." Hamish felt heat rise under his collar. Even Luggs growled at that. He marched up to the hotel. The place looked as it always did in winter. Damp stone walls, windows fogged from poor heating, and a sense of expense that wasn't quite achieved. Inside, Johnson hovered near the reception desk like a hen in a draught. His hair stuck out at odd angles. "Oh, Macbeth, thank heavens," he said. "They're talking about shutting us down. Journalists are sniffing around, and someone said the sea cask was torn open by an animal." "That's nonsense," Hamish said. "Where's the cellar?" Johnson led him down the stairs, wringing his hands all the way. The cellar smelled of damp wood and spilled whisky. A dark stain ran in a crooked line across the floor to the drain. Hamish knelt and examined it. There was a faint smell of seaweed, which made no sense. He noticed a scrap of rope caught on a nail, the fibres damp. "That rope wasn't there last night," Johnson said. "You're sure?" Hamish asked. Of course I'm sure. I'd have noticed. I cleaned, well, tidied, this place before bed. Hamish pocketed the rope scrap. This is human work, he said. No animal's got hands for rope. Johnson's eyes bulged. But folk are talking about your cat. Someone told me she chewed through the wood like a demon. Hamish stood up sharply, bumping his head on a low beam. The pain made his temper flare. The cat didn't chew through anything. Are people daft? Johnson flinched. I'm only repeating what I heard. Then stop hearing it, Hamish snapped. He regretted the words the moment they escaped. His temper always betrayed him around Johnson's nervousness. Still, the man brought out the worst instinct in anyone. A door banged upstairs. Footsteps pounded toward the cellar. Hamish knew the rhythm at once. Blair. Blair arrived with Anderson slinking behind him like a badly trained dog. So this is the mess, Macbeth, Blair barked. You were meant to guard the cask. Instead you let some animal knock it over. Or was it your own cat? Wouldn't shock me. Flea-ridden brute. Hamish straightened. It was theft, not an animal. Ha! Blair jabbed a finger at him. You always protect that wildcat cross. Daviot's losing his mind about this. Press coverage, tourist confidence, you've embarrassed us again. Anderson nodded like a puppet. Very embarrassing indeed, he murmured. Hamish scratched Lugs's ear to keep from losing his temper. Sonsie crept in behind them, silent as smoke. Blair's eyes bulged when he saw her. Get that savage thing out of here. If it scratched the barrel, I'll have it put down. You're not laying a finger on Sonsie, Hamish said before thinking. Blair smirked. Oh? We'll see what the law says. Hamish cursed himself silently. He had fallen into the exact trap Blair wanted, defending something instead of giving facts. Priscilla appeared then at the top of the stairs, calm as ever, pale but composed in a way that made Hamish feel twice as shabby. She descended slowly, ignoring Blair. This cannot be allowed to ruin Hogmanay, she said. The festivities go on. The hotel must not close. Johnson wrung his hands harder. But if we don't solve this, bookings will cancel. Already people are asking for refunds. Blair puffed out his chest. Leave the solving to Strathbane. Macbeth has already proved he can't handle it. Priscilla looked at Hamish briefly. He couldn't read her expression. Approval? Disappointment? Something colder? Whatever it was, it unsettled him. They all trooped back upstairs, the atmosphere thick with blame. In the bar, Hamish saw 3 villagers whispering near the window. When they spotted him, they stiffened. Mrs. Campbell, never one to hide her opinions, sniffed loudly. He should control that cat. It's dangerous. Hamish stopped. Sonsie wasn't anywhere near the cask last night. Mrs. Campbell gave a tight smile. So you say. Maybe you trained it, another villager muttered. Hamish felt the air leave him. He looked at Sonsie, who was cleaning her paw with a certain menace. Folk hated Sonsie because she reminded them of wild things they couldn't control. She was the perfect scapegoat. Blair seized the moment. In light of this suspicion, he announced loudly, I'm not above putting down a vicious cat if it's involved. A small gasp went through the bar. Hamish said, You're talking rubbish. Blair sneered, enjoying himself. Folk here are frightened. They deserve protection. Sonsie didn't do anything, Hamish said, louder than he intended. Lugs whined and pressed close to him. The journalist from the previous night lifted his pen with interest. There it was again. Blair steering the room, Hamish stumbling behind like a man with 2 left feet. The villagers watched, some with sympathy, most with doubt. Hamish hated the feeling. The village was his patch, yet every rumour made him foreign in it. After Blair left to secure evidence, Anderson trailing behind, Priscilla approached Hamish. This must not escalate further, she said. We cannot have panic. Hamish wanted to tell her to take her English calmness and bury it in a peat bog, but instead he said, I'll do what I can. I hope so, she replied. Her tone held no warmth, only expectation. He turned away, ashamed of his own prickliness. Outside, the sky hung low and colourless. Sonsie shot ahead of him, disappearing into the damp heather as if she had never belonged to anyone. Hamish envied her freedom for a moment. Lugs bumped his leg, needing reassurance. Hamish rubbed his head absent-mindedly. The phone at the station rang just as he reached the door. He lifted it, already bracing. Daviot's strained voice screeched in his ear. Macbeth, this whiskey business is all over the papers. Fix it immediately. Tourists will flee. We cannot afford a scandal. It's being handled, Hamish said. By whom? Daviot demanded. Blair? "That idiot! You and your animals have ruined enough." Something cold settled in Hamish then. "I'll sort it," he said, and hung up before Daviot could hurl more insults. He sat down heavily. Lugs crawled under his hand. Sonsie slunk in and hopped onto the windowsill, tail twitching. She looked smug, as if the entire village deserved the chaos she caused simply by existing. Hamish stared at her. "You've caused trouble without lifting a paw," he said. "Typical." Sonsie blinked slowly, unbothered. Hamish knew one thing. The lie about her had taken root. Now he had to dig it out before the village turned savage. The whiskey was stolen, drained and shifted with hands, rope and a plan. But the village preferred an easier story. A beast to blame, a policeman to shame, and a scandal to pass round their tables. Hamish felt the weight of all of it pressing on him in the cold, dim station. He would have to move fast, but the village was against him. Strathbane was against him, and even Priscilla's steady gaze felt like judgment. He stood, uneasy and determined. Tomorrow would be worse. The drizzle had already seeped into Hamish's sleeves before he reached the first croft, and it felt like the sort that would cling all day. Something was wrong the moment he stepped out. The village was too quiet in sound, yet too loud in feeling. Lugs trotted beside him with that uneasy gait he had when the world felt tense. Sonsie appeared and disappeared between rocks like a ghost that enjoyed making folk nervous. Hamish wished she'd stay hidden. She made everything worse these days. He meant only to walk from the crofts toward the post office, but every door he passed seemed to conceal whispers. A curtain twitched in Mrs. Stewart's window. A man at a gate nodded stiffly, then turned away, whispering before Hamish had taken 5 steps. The theft had grown overnight. It was no longer a simple stolen cask. It was a story being chewed into 100 flavours, all bitter. At the Kirk Hall he found a cluster of women hanging bunting for the Hogmanay Sailey. Their voices carried too easily in the damp air. Mrs. Wellington, tall and self-important, said, "It'll be that jealous publican from over the hill. He hates the hotel getting all the trade. Mark my words." "Aye," said another, "or thieves from Inverness. They'd steal the teeth out ye if you stood still long enough." A fisherman appeared with a crate of decorations and grunted, "Could be smugglers. Folk forget there are still boats bringing in things they shouldna." Hamish stepped inside the doorway. "Smugglers wouldna bother wi' Hogmanay whisky," he said. "Too much fuss attached." Mrs. Wellington turned with a look that made him feel 12 years old. "Morning, Constable. We were just saying, there's usually a reason when things go wrong." Hamish forced a thin smile. "Aye, and usually the reason is someone daft, not an international conspiracy." But even as he said it, more speculation piled on. A woman claimed she'd heard the cask had been switched entirely. Another said the hotel never checked the delivery because they trusted everyone too much. A third said the whiskey was cursed anyway, and Hamish should stop it from being served. The pressure pushed into Hamish's skull. He seized on the nearest explanation that seemed simple, though he should have held his tongue. "Maybe the lorry driver took a wee dram for himself and topped it up with water," he said. It slipped out too quickly without thought, but relief washed through the women. A culprit, an outsider, a man passing through. It fit their need. "That sounds right," Mrs. Wellington said, nodding to herself as if Hamish had confirmed her suspicions. "Aye," another woman chimed in. "He looked shifty." "He was tired," Hamish muttered, already regretting opening his mouth. "Not shifty." But the idea took root. The fisherman snorted. "If the man drinks on the job, it's a wonder he drives at all." His voice travelled across the hall, picked up by ears that loved trouble. Hamish snapped, "I didna say he was drunk. Folk are awfully quick to twist things." But it was too late. Even Lugs gave him a sideways look as if he knew Hamish had made a mistake. He left the Kirk Hall feeling the gossip chase after him like a bad smell. The drizzle thickened. Sonsie jumped onto a stone wall, crouching like she meant to pounce on the next rumour. Her pale eyes followed Hamish with disapproval. "You're not helping," he told her. By the time he reached Patel's shop, the rumour had travelled faster than his feet. When he entered, the small crowd inside went silent for a fraction of a second. Mrs. Patel raised her eyebrows. "Constable Macbeth, we've just been discussing that driver of yours." "He's not my driver," Hamish said. A man picking out apples said. "He looked like the sort. Red nose, shifty. Might have helped himself, then blamed someone else." Hamish felt cornered. "What sort? Folk says ought when they've nothing to say." Mrs. Patel gave a polite smile that felt like a slap. "People want reassurance, Constable. They want to hear that someone's at fault who's not from here. So we blame the driver because he's not local, Hamish said. You said he might have taken a dram, the apple man muttered. Hamish stiffened. His own words had come home to roost like a sick chicken. I said nothing of the kind, he lied, though weakly. Oh, but you did, Mrs. Patel said sweetly, or something near enough. The driver himself walked in at that moment to collect a parcel Patel had phoned about. His face was grim even before he saw Hamish. So you're the one spreading lies, he demanded. I hear half the village thinks I stole the whiskey. Hamish felt the shame rise. I didn't say that. You called me drunk. The man's voice rose with each word. Or a thief. Or both. Folk gathered around like gulls. Hamish heard someone whisper, Aye, that's him. The guilty look. I never said that, Hamish repeated, though now he wasn't entirely sure what he had said. The driver jabbed a finger at him. I'm reporting you. I'll not take this from some village copper who can't keep his own animals under control. Hamish tried to salvage the moment. Calm yourself. There's been a misunderstanding. A misunderstanding because you opened your gob where it wasn't needed, the driver snapped. Luggs growled, but Hamish held him back. The driver left with a final glare. Mrs. Patel tutted. Well, that went poorly. Aye, Hamish muttered. Thank you for stating the obvious. He stalked out, humiliated. The drizzle had turned into thin, unpleasant rain that felt like spite. Sonsie appeared again, weaving between his legs as if mocking his authority. Even Luggs stayed a step behind, ears low. Hamish stood at the churchyard gate and rubbed his forehead. Luggs whined softly. Something was wrong here beyond gossip. He felt the pressure building like a too-full kettle. If this kept up, the village would turn on itself. As he walked toward the hotel, a young fisher caught up with him. Saw a strange van near the old pier last night, the lad said, but I didn't see the number. It was dark. Hamish waited for more, but the lad shrugged. Could have been anything. He walked off quickly, not wanting involvement. A classic Loch Dhu refusal. At the hotel, Hamish found Johnson in the office pretending to shuffle papers. When Hamish entered, the man snapped the ledger shut. Too quickly. Hamish said, What's that? Nothing, Johnson said, too sharp, too nervous. Hamish reached for the ledger. Let me see. Johnson hesitated, then opened it reluctantly. Hamish saw the page for beverage orders. There was an ink smear over the number of bottles ordered for the New Year event. Clumsy, Johnson said, snatching the book away. Spilled tea. Tea doesn't smear ink like that, Hamish said. Johnson shut the book harder. You think I'm lying? I've enough trouble without your suspicions. Then stop acting like you've something to hide, Hamish said. He'd meant it plain, but the words came out cruel. Johnson's small, pinched face crumpled slightly, and Hamish regretted the tone, but not the suspicion. He left before the man could whine further. The hotel corridor smelled of stale carpet and too many tourists. Above him, laughter drifted from a lounge where people had no idea their presence rested on a ruined cask. Outside, the drizzle finally eased, but the wind kept gossip alive. Hamish heard two men whispering near the bins. Maybe Macbeth's covering for that cat, one said. He always liked animals more than folk, the other replied. Hamish could have shouted, but it would only feed the fire. He headed home with Luggs trotting close, ears flicking at every sound. Sonsie followed from a distance, her tail held high, her gaze fixed on him in a way that made him feel judged. At the station, Hamish sat behind his desk, staring at the rope scrap. Seaweed on the cellar floor. A strange van. A nervous manager. A ledger altered. A driver humiliated by Hamish's own loose tongue. He rubbed his eyes. He'd backed the wrong accusation. Again. It was becoming a habit. Sonsie leapt onto the table, knocking papers aside. Hamish looked at her. You're not helping, he said. She blinked. Outside, the wind pushed against the window with a dull, persistent groan, as if the whole village was waiting for him to fix something he had only made worse. Hamish felt the weight of it settle on his shoulders. Tomorrow would not be kinder. Something was already wrong before Hamish even stepped into the hotel lounge. He could hear Blair's booming voice echoing down the corridor like a cow trapped in a tin shed. Luggs stopped at the doorway and whined, flattening his ears. Even Hamish felt the same urge. Blair had turned the lounge into one of his petty throne rooms, and the smell of wet coats steaming by the fire mixed with old whisky and fear. It was the sort of smell Strathbane brought with it. "Macbeth!" Blair barked the moment Hamish entered, as if he'd been waiting just to shout his name. "Get over here! You're standing there like a stray dog." Hamish kept his face blank, though he felt the heat rise under his collar. Anderson sat beside Blair, scribbling on a pad with such earnest nodding that Hamish wondered whether the man understood a thing he wrote. Probably not. A shy barmaid perched on a chair across from Blair, twisting her apron. Blair leaned forward, eyes gleaming. "You were near the cellar at what time?" I was taking the glasses down," she said. 10:30, maybe." "Maybe?" Blair snapped. "This is gross negligence, Macbeth. Gross negligence." Anderson nodded as if the phrase were a hymn. Hamish tried to steer things towards sense. "She's not the thief, Blair. Let the lass breathe." Blair shot him a glare. "Don't interrupt my investigation. You've made enough of a mess already." He turned back to the girl. "You're dismissed, but don't go far. I may need to question you again if Macbeth's incompetence forces my hand." The girl hurried off, nearly tripping. Hamish suppressed a sigh. It would be a long day. More guests were arranged on chairs as if awaiting execution. Hamish noticed a thin man with a notebook on his knee, looking both bored and irritated. He wore a tweed jacket that tried too hard to impress. Hamish recognised him. Ferguson, the whisky writer who had arrived the night before with an air of self-importance. Blair jabbed a finger at him. "You. What were you promised when you booked?" he demanded, as if Ferguson had personally drained the cask. "Exclusive access for an article," Ferguson said, annoyed. "A photograph with the Hogmanay cask, that's all." "Aha," Blair almost shouted. "Exclusive access. Sounds like motive to interfere." Hamish winced. "Blair, the man writes about whisky. He wasn't going to lug away a full barrel on his back." Blair ignored him. "Write that down, Anderson." Anderson scribbled furiously, nodding so hard his glasses nearly fell off. "I only wanted a photograph," Ferguson protested. "I'm not a thief." "So you say," Blair snapped. "Macbeth, you should have checked every guest, but of course you were too busy playing shepherd to that wildcat of yours." Hamish felt the blood rush to his ears. "Leave the animals out of it." A murmur went through the room. The tourists were enjoying the show far too much. Blair conducted more interviews, each one clumsier than the last. He accused a pensioner of having shifty eyes, a honeymooner of hiding guilt behind those fancy city shoes, and an elderly gentleman of faking deafness to escape questioning. The man wasn't deaf, but Hamish suspected he wished he were. After an hour of this chaos, the rain outside turned the hotel drive into a grey slurry. A porter stepped in just long enough to track mud across the carpet and mutter about someone's car sliding sideways. Hamish envied the porter's escape. At last, Blair waved a hand. "Enough of these amateurs. Macbeth, outside. Now." Hamish followed him out to the hotel entrance where the rain drummed heavily on the awning. Priscilla was waiting under an umbrella, her coat immaculate despite the weather. She looked as if the rain parted around her out of respect. Hamish found himself painfully aware of his muddy shoes. "Hamish," she said in a cool tone that hit harder than anger. "This will not do." He stood straighter. "What will not do?" "Father says if this isn't cleared up quickly, he'll never lend the castle's name to another event. People talk, Hamish, and the talk isn't kind." Hamish felt small beside her. "I'm working on it." "You must work faster," she said. Her eyes flicked over his damp hair, his wrinkled jacket. "Tourists won't wait for our reputations to repair themselves." Blair snorted. "He works slower than a drunk snail." Priscilla didn't even look at Blair. Somehow that made it worse. Hamish nodded stiffly. "I'll look into it." She closed the umbrella slightly. "See that you do." She walked away with that smooth stride that reminded Hamish of everything he wasn't. He watched her go until the rain swallowed her up. Blair gave a satisfied grunt. "Back inside," he barked. "We've more fools to interrogate." But Hamish didn't follow him. Instead, he drifted toward the kitchen. Something felt off. The hotel cook, Mrs. McCowan, stood by the sink scrubbing a pan with an aggression that suggested she'd been listening to Blair's shouting for too long. "Morning," Hamish said. She didn't bother hiding her irritation. "It's barely morning anymore." Hamish looked around. That was when he saw it. A chipped side plate on the counter with a dark amber ring marking its centre. The whisky had been good, expensive, judging by the colour. Beside it were two ordinary glasses, the sort staff used when they weren't meant to. "Who was drinking in here after hours?" Hamish asked. Mrs. McCowan shrugged without looking up. "Folk have to warm up somehow. That cellar's freezing." "Which folk?" he pressed. She dropped the pan into the sink with a splash. "I've enough work without tattling. Go chase your thief and leave my kitchen be." Hamish leaned closer to examine the plate. The whisky sheen told him someone had been sampling something finer than what the hotel usually poured for staff. A clue, small but clear. Someone had access beyond the guests. Before he could ask more, Blair stormed into the kitchen. "Macbeth, you're clutching at teacups while a crime scene rots under your nose." Hamish straightened slowly. "Just doing the job, Blair." "Ha!" Blair barked. "If this is what you call doing a job, no wonder Strathbane never wants you back." Mrs. McCowan gave Hamish a sympathetic look before turning away, but even sympathy couldn't soothe the sting. Blair marched out again, expecting Hamish to trail like a chastened terrier. Hamish refused, staying in the kitchen doorway long enough to watch the cook hide the side plate under a towel. She didn't want involved. No one ever did until it was too late. Back in the lounge, Blair was bellowing for Anderson to fetch the phone. "Daviot's ringing again. He'll want answers." Anderson scampered like a frightened rabbit. Hamish braced himself. Daviot's voice shrieked through the receiver, audible even from across the room. Blair made sure everyone heard. "Yes, sir. Appalling situation, sir. A disgrace. Macbeth, sir. Yes, Macbeth has bungled it again." Hamish felt lugs press against his shin, whining quietly. Even Sonsie had appeared in the hallway, peering around the corner as if judging whether the shouting concerned her. Probably she decided it wasn't worth her attention. Blair thrust the phone at Hamish. "Your turn to be scolded." Hamish took the receiver. "Macbeth here." Daviot's voice was a thin wire of panic. "This whisky fiasco is in the papers, do you understand? Reporters are circling like vultures. Fix it, Macbeth. I want progress, swift progress." "We're working on it," Hamish said. "Not good enough," Daviot cried. "Your village is turning into a circus." Hamish hung up before Daviot could add more insults. Blair smirked. "Couldn't handle a wee telling off." Hamish ignored him. The guests were watching now, whispering. The staff looked uneasy. Even Priscilla, who had returned briefly to collect something, paused to watch Blair berate him further. Blair raised his voice. "This is Macbeth's fault. If he'd secured the scene properly, we'd have answers. Instead, all we have is mud, lies, and cat hair." Someone snickered. Hamish's cheeks burned. "Stop shouting," he said quietly. Blair leaned in. "Make me." Hamish felt something twist inside him. Not rage, just tiredness. Tiredness of being the village idiot in Blair's stories. Tiredness of Strathbane treating him like a child. Tiredness of trying to keep Lochdu safe, only to be treated as its least competent resident. He turned away. "I'll go check the grounds." "Run away, you mean?" Blair crowed. "Like always." Hamish left without looking back. Outside, the rain had turned the drive into a filthy soup. His shoes sank into it with each step. Lugs followed miserably. The hotel's windows glowed weakly, shapes moving inside like figures trapped in a lantern. Sonsie darted ahead, tail stiff, as if she intended to stalk the next rumour. Hamish walked behind the hotel, though he avoided turning it into one of his thinking walks. The mud sucked at his boots. The bins smelled foul. Somewhere in the distance he heard a lorry grinding along the road. He wished it were the end of this business, but it wasn't. He crouched to inspect the muddy ground. No grand clue emerged, only a few footprints and a rusty bottle cap. Still, something tugged at him. The whisky ring on the kitchen plate, the cook's evasiveness, Johnson's trembling hands, Priscilla's cold disappointment, Ferguson's annoyance, the tourists' whispers. Everyone had a piece of the truth, but no one wanted to hand it over. He headed back inside, weary and soaked, only to hear Blair exclaim loudly from the lounge, "Macbeth, get in here! You can't hide forever!" Hamish paused in the doorway. Half the hotel looked at him with open suspicion. Johnson wrung his hands. Priscilla stood near the window, her face expressionless. Blair jabbed a finger at him. "This mess, this utter disaster, is because you can't manage your own village." Hamish said nothing. Saying anything would only feed Blair's temper. "Stand there and take responsibility," Blair said. Hamish stood because there was nothing else to do. His authority in Lochdu felt thin, stretched. He felt like a scarecrow someone had forgotten to stuff properly. Priscilla gave him one brief, unreadable look. Then she turned away, and Hamish felt the humiliation settle in like damp in old stone, cold and hard to shift. The day wasn't over, but he already knew tomorrow would demand even more of him. Something was already wrong the moment Hamish stepped out of the station that morning. The wind had swung north in the night, bringing a sharp cold that bit at his face. Luggs hesitated at the threshold, nose twitching. Sonsie shot out ahead of them like an arrow, her tail bristling as if she meant to fight the weather itself. Hamish wished he shared her confidence. He hadn't even reached the hotel walkway when he saw a bulky, tweed-coated figure storming toward the doors, sleet sliding off his hat. Mr. Macready, the distillery owner, moved like a man ready to sack half the Highlands. Hamish almost turned around, but Luggs trotted forward, forcing him on. In the foyer, Macready shook the melting sleet from his hat with disdain, as if the weather offended him personally. Blair and Anderson lurked nearby, clearly holding court where they had no right to. Priscilla stood a little apart, cool and unreadable. Macready glared at Johnson, who was sweating through his collar. "I could have sold that cask 3 times over," Macready said, "but I trusted this place. A mistake, evidently." Johnson wrung his hands. "We're doing everything possible." "Oh, spare me," Macready snapped. "You've got debts, man. Everybody knows. Maybe losing a barrel into the night seemed easier than paying for it." Johnson's mouth opened and shut like a fish. "I would never. Hamish watched Macready's eyes flick to the tourist brochures stacked on the counter. He wasn't looking at the pictures. He was counting the revenue bleeding away. Blair stepped forward, puffed up like a rooster. "I assure you, Mr. Macready, Strathbane police are handling this. Macbeth here has blundered things enough already." Hamish kept his face flat. "We've only just begun." "You began wrong," Blair snapped. Priscilla's voice slid between them, icy but polite. "Gentlemen, this is not helping matters." Macready ignored her. "If this theft stands, the distillery cuts ties. I won't be made a fool of. The cask bore our thistle mark near the base, burned in so no substitute could be passed off. If the contents are gone, it was stolen with knowledge. A small clue, thrown out casually." Hamish tucked it away. Blair nodded solemnly, though Hamish doubted he understood half of it. "We'll find it, sir." "You'd better," Macready said. "If I have to call in private investigators, I'll be billing the hotel." His gaze swept the foyer, lingering on Johnson long enough to make the man sag like a punctured balloon. When Macready strode out again into the sleet, tourists parted like nervous sheep, murmuring. Priscilla exhaled faintly, the closest she ever came to showing strain. Johnson leaned against the wall, wiping at his forehead. Hamish felt the tension gathering in the hall like a bad smell. "I'll look into it," he murmured, though he wasn't sure anyone heard him. Outside, the cold hit him harder. Luggs pressed close. Sonsie leapt onto a low stone wall and stared down at Hamish with a superior air. He muttered, "You're not helping," which only amused her. He made for Patel's shop, because trouble always fermented there faster than whisky. Sure enough, when he entered, Mrs. Patel stood behind the counter with an air of grim satisfaction. Several villagers clustered around Macready, who must have detoured to spread his displeasure. A fisherman was saying, "If the hotel's sloppy, we all pay. Tourists will go where things don't vanish." Mrs. Patel added, "Folk are saying this is a crooked wee place. It doesn't take much to scare visitors off." Macready nodded as if he were a judge delivering sentence. "I warned them. If the people running this hotel can't be trusted, there'll be consequences." Hamish cleared his throat. "We're investigating." Macready turned to him sharply. "Investigate faster, Constable. A child could have solved this by now." Murmurs of agreement rippled through the shop. Hamish kept his jaw tight. The villagers weren't just agreeing with Macready. They were hiding behind him, using his outrage to shield their own fears. An old crofter near the back pointed a gnarled finger at Hamish. "You'll fix it, won't you? We cannot afford this sort of scandal." It was more demand than question, and far from encouragement. "I'll do what I can," Hamish said. "That's not enough," someone muttered. Macready seized his chance. "Maybe I will bring in outside help. A private investigator who actually takes this seriously." Blair appeared behind Hamish like a bad smell. "Now that is an excellent idea, sir. Shows you what the whisky men think of Macbeth." Hamish glared. "Stop twisting everything." "I twist nothing," Blair said smugly. "The village deserves better." Hamish felt the room press in on him. Even Luggs edged behind his leg, sensing the shift. Sonsie poked her head through the shop door, tail lashing, earning a hiss of fear from Mrs. Patel. "You keep that monster out," she snapped. Hamish stepped aside, allowing the cat in. "She's done nothing." "Yet," Mrs. Patel said darkly. Macready shook his head. "This place is falling apart. I expected more professionalism." He swept out, taking half the room's confidence with him. The villagers drifted after him, leaving Hamish standing alone near the tins of biscuits. Mrs. Patel stared at him with faint disappointment. "You ought to control things better." "Aye," Hamish said. "I'll get right on that." He left before she could scold him more. The wind had worsened. It shoved at Hamish as he made his way toward the station. Lugs trudged beside him, miserable. Sonsie darted ahead, claws clicking on patches of frozen ground. Hamish rubbed his temple. Macready's thistle mark, a clue, small but real. At least it proved the cask hadn't been swapped in some clever scheme, unless someone had taken the trouble to burn a second mark. But thieves rarely had patience for artistry. He passed the Kirk Hall, where decorations hung limp in the wind. 2 villagers stopped talking when he approached. One gave him a little nod, polite but cold. The other didn't bother hiding her mistrust. Everything hurt his pride today. Even the trees looked as if they disapproved of him. When he reached the station, the phone was already ringing. He picked up. Blair's voice spat down the line. "Macbeth, Macready's threatening the chief superintendent again. If this collapses, it's on your head." "It's always on my head," Hamish said. Blair ignored him. "Get results, or I'll have Daviot pull you out of Lochdu by your ears." Hamish hung up. He sat heavily, lugs crawling into his lap, shivering. Sonsie leapt onto the desk and stared at him with her cold, wild confidence. "Everyone's against me," Hamish muttered. Sonsie blinked as if to say that was nothing new. Wind rattled the window pane, the whole village breathing uneasily. Hamish felt the shift clearly now. Lochdu's faith in him thinning like old cloth, and once it tore, no stitching would mend it. Tomorrow would demand more of him than today had allowed. The wind kept worrying at the village like a dog with a bone, and Hamish could feel the scandal settling deeper into Lochdu's habits. He went back to the station with Macready's thistle mark turning over in his mind, knowing the next piece of trouble would arrive before the day was out. Something was wrong long before Hamish rose from his bed. Sleet rattled against the station windows like handfuls of thrown stones, the sort of weather that kept even determined thieves indoors. Yet Lugs whined in his basket as if he sensed an intruder, and Sonsie prowled around the room with her tail flicking in nasty little jerks. Hamish lay awake, staring at the ceiling, feeling the weight of Lochdu's expectations pressing in on him until the room grew too small to breathe in. Finally, he swung his legs out of bed. "We'll go out then," he muttered, though neither animal had asked. Lugs perked up, hopeful despite the sleet. Sonsie leapt to the windowsill and glared at him with her pale, hostile eyes. If ever a cat blamed her owner for the failings of the world, it was Sonsie tonight. Hamish dragged on his old coat and stepped outside. The cold hit him like a wet plank. The road glittered dully under patches of half-frozen water. He told himself he was only going to check on things, but he knew that was nonsense. He was going because lying still made him feel helpless, and helplessness reminded him too much of Strathbane. Lugs trotted at his heel, ears twitching at each gust of wind. Sonsie darted ahead, her paws somehow avoiding every slick patch. The village slept uneasily, lights showing through curtains here and there. Hamish kept his head down against the sleet and made his way toward the hotel. When he reached the back entrance, he paused. A faint yellow line of light spilled through the cracked kitchen door, pooling on the slushy ground. Fresh footprints muddled the wet surface. The sound of a voice carried out, low, strained, and too hurried to be a late-night chat. Hamish stepped into the shadow beside a stack of crates. Lugs pressed against his leg, trembling. Sonsie climbed atop the crates, tail flicking like a metronome. Inside, Johnson's voice rose in sharp fear. "I can't get more credit," Johnson said. "The cask is gone, do you understand? Gone. No, I don't care what you threaten. I've nothing left to sell." A pause followed, one so taut Hamish felt the hairs rise on his arms. Then Johnson said flatly, "It's not my neck alone on the line." Hamish leaned in, but Sonsie chose that moment to hop down, knocking over a metal bucket with a resounding clang. The noise sliced the night in two. Johnson's voice cut off. The kitchen door slammed shut. Hamish swore under his breath. He nudged Sonsie with his boot, gently but not kindly. "Bloody nuisance," he whispered. He pushed open the kitchen door as if he had only just arrived. Johnson stood rigid near the counter, pale and sweating. "Evening," Hamish said, trying a casual tone that fooled no one. "Just checking all secure." Johnson forced a smile so strained it barely held together. "Couldn't sleep either," he said far too quickly. "Thought I'd tidy the kitchen a bit. Busy days, you know how it is." "Aye," Hamish said. He looked around the kitchen without appearing to. The place was too tidy, too still. The faint smell of strong whisky lingered in the air, far richer than what the hotel usually poured. Johnson shifted from foot to foot, wringing his hands. Hamish walked toward the counter. Johnson stepped sideways, blocking him. "Lots to do," Johnson said. "Preparations. Mustn't fall behind." Hamish let his gaze drift to the phone receiver, still slightly askew. "Aye," he said. "Folk are under pressure." Johnson swallowed. "Terrible business, that cask." Hamish nodded. "Terrible." He moved toward the door. "I'll leave you to your tidying." Johnson exhaled in sharp relief, which told Hamish more than another hour of questioning would have. Something had him cornered, and he was trying, and failing, to hide it. Hamish stepped back outside. The sleet had thickened. Sonsie shot ahead, her paws tapping briskly against the ice. Lugg stayed close, shivering as if sensing Johnson's panic still clinging to Hamish's coat. He headed home by the long path past the kirk. The cold bit through his trousers, but he forced himself on. The wind buffeted him from the side, pushing hard enough to make him stumble. Sonsie darted ahead into a hedge, then emerged with something dangling from her mouth. Hamish snatched it before she could chew it. It was a whisky crate splinter, still smelling faintly of expensive malt. Nearby, half shoved beneath the hedge, lay an empty crate with its label peeled clean off. The straw inside was damp, crushed, and far too fresh to be rubbish tossed aside days ago. Hamish crouched, rubbing a thumb across the wood. A tiny char streak marked the splinter's edge. Not much, but maybe enough. "Thistle, maybe," he muttered to himself. "Macready's thistle burn, or a coincidence." But coincidences were growing thin in Lochdu. He pocketed the splinter, feeling its damp weight like another problem added to his pile. Sonsie circled him, tail twitching. She wanted him to praise her for finding it, but he only shook his head. "You think you're helping," he said, "but I'm not sure you are." The cold worsened. The sleet hammered down with renewed spite. Hamish trudged on, his boots slipping on the half-ice, half-mud surface. Lugg slunk behind him, weary and cold. Sonsie darted ahead, her outline blurring through the sleet. He reached the station feeling older than he had an hour earlier. Inside, the warmth was only barely enough to thaw his fingers. Lugs flopped heavily into his basket, curling up in a tight ball. Sonsie leapt onto the desk and shoved a stack of papers onto the floor, as if asserting her dominance over both the case and Hamish. Hamish sat down and placed the crate splinter on the desk. He had half a clue at best, a nervous hotel manager who was lying about something, and a village ready to believe any fool theory except the one that pointed inward. He rubbed his temple. The thought he didn't want to face began to settle more firmly. Johnson might not be incompetent. He might be involved. But Hamish had no proof, no leverage, nothing but suspicion and a splinter. He stared at the window. The sleet rattled like restless fingers. Lochdu slept in uneasy silence, unaware that its trust in him was hanging by a fraying thread. He leaned back, feeling the exhaustion seep into his bones. Sonsie settled beside the splinter, her pale eyes watching him with what looked like contempt. "Better than Blair watching me," Hamish muttered. The room felt too still, too expectant. Tomorrow would bring questions he wasn't ready to answer. He closed his eyes and the cold wind outside moaned around the station like something waiting. The night was far from over. By the time Hamish trudged back into the village, the rain had washed away his tracks, but not his embarrassment. Lochdu had already found a new flavour of panic to chew on, and this time it wasn't just gossip. Something was wrong before Hamish even stepped out of the station that morning. Rain hammered the roof with a steady fury, as if the sky itself meant to wash Lochdu clean of embarrassment. Lugs paced in circles, whining. Sonsie stared out the window, tail lashing, her whole posture suggesting that if the village had any sense, it would hide indoors until spring. But Hamish could not hide. The rumour about the rival hotel had spread through Lochdu like mould in a warm cupboard, and now half the villagers thought someone in the next village was pouring their stolen Hogmanay whisky into elegant glasses. Daviot had phoned even before Hamish finished his tea, shrieking down the line about duty and public trust. Hamish hung up on him halfway through, so instead of sitting behind his desk doing the paperwork he loathed, Hamish trudged out into the soaking morning. Mud sucked at his boots, the wind bit at his face. Sonsie followed at a distance, choosing the driest stones with what looked like contempt for his clumsy path. He met a farmer near the edge of the village, a man wrapped so tightly in oilskins he looked like a walking pile of tar. The farmer gave Hamish a look halfway between pity and amusement. "You're after that whisky again," he said. Hamish nodded. "Aye, folk keep spreading tales faster than I can stamp them out." "Well," the farmer said, scratching his chin, "I heard old Donal's got a barrel in his shed. Been bragging he'll drink better than the toffs at New Year." Hamish stopped. "A barrel?" "So they say." The farmer shrugged. "Could be nothing, could be more than nothing. But Donal's been awful pleased with himself these days." Hamish muttered something unkind about gossip. Still, a barrel was a barrel, and he had no choice but to check. Daviot would scream again if he ignored it. When he returned to fetch the police car, Blair and Anderson were already lurking near it, as if waiting to pounce on any mistake. Blair looked Hamish up and down. "Going somewhere, Macbeth?" "Donal's Croft," Blair grinned. "Ah, a lead. And you thought to run off without telling Strathbane?" He shoved Anderson toward the car. "We're coming." Hamish didn't argue. There was no point. Blair was spoiling for glory, and Anderson would nod along like a toy with a loose spring. The drive out to Donal's Croft was miserable. Rain pelted the windscreen. The wipers squeaked like an old couple bickering. Blair complained about Hamish's driving, Anderson about the mud, and Luggs whimpered every time the car jolted over a rut. Donal's yard was a sea of muck. Chickens fled in all directions as Hamish stepped out. Sonsie leapt onto a fence post and watched from above, looking pleased with the chaos. "Macbeth," Blair shouted. "Look there." Hamish followed the direction of Blair's triumphant finger. Beside the byre, half hidden by a sagging wall, stood a stout whisky barrel. Straw lay at its base. Something about its posture in the mud made Hamish's heartbeat quicken. Blair puffed out his chest. "Caught red-handed, Macbeth. You couldn't see a barrel if it danced in front of you." Donal emerged from the croft, a stocky man with a face that had weathered more storms than the old boats in the harbour. He saw Blair pointing and bellowed, "What in God's name are you doing at my shed?" Hamish rubbed his forehead. "Donal, we just need a look." "No, you don't." Donal stomped toward them, chickens scattering again. "You Strathbane fools think every barrel north of Inverness belongs to you." Blair ignored him. "Open it, Macbeth." Hamish sighed. He stepped into the shed. The air smelled of damp straw, rusted tools, and stubborn pride. His breath steamed in the cold. He tapped the barrel with his knuckles. It sounded solid enough. Luggs sniffed at the base, then sneezed. Hamish prized the bung loose. A sour, vinegary smell seeped out, infecting the air at once. Nothing like good whisky. Nothing like anything anyone sane would drink. Donal let out a roar of fury. "That's my brother's homebrew. Been there since the year before last. You wreck it, you pay, you Strathbane buffoon." Blair took a quick step back, nose wrinkling. Anderson gagged faintly. Villagers, drawn by the shouting, gathered at the doorway. Hamish saw more than one smirk. Donal jabbed a thick finger at him. "Happy now? Folk'll say I steal. All because you two can't do your job." "That smell could kill a cow," someone whispered, earning a round of laughter. Hamish's face burned. "Sorry, Donal. We had to check." "Check? You never check on the right folk. You barged in here, ruined my brew, and made a fool of me." Blair puffed up again, unwilling to accept even a shred of blame. It was Macbeth's idea. Hamish felt the humiliation deepen. He muttered a stiff apology, though it made no dent in Donal's anger. People were enjoying the spectacle far too much. Lochdew liked seeing others humbled, as long as they themselves weren't next. As Blair strutted outside to bark some order or other at Anderson, Hamish lingered in the shed. Something had caught his eye among Donal's clutter. A length of new rope, much cleaner than anything else in the place. Cut at an angle, crisp ends. "Where'd you get that rope?" Hamish asked. Donal glared at him. "A travelling man sold it to me." "When?" "None of your business." Hamish picked up the rope. It felt too new to belong to Donal, whose habits leaned toward never buying anything until the old version disintegrated completely. The cut end reminded him of the scrap he'd found at the hotel. He set it down. Coincidence, or another piece in a puzzle that refused to fit. Outside, the drizzle thickened. The villagers were muttering as they drifted away, amused at Hamish's expense. Blair strutted toward the car, convinced he had done something important. Hamish walked back through the mud, Luggs slinking behind him, Sonsie disappearing into the rain like a ghost. He had no suspects, no whiskey, no goodwill left, and now no dignity either. The worst part was knowing tomorrow would bring even less. Something was wrong before Hamish even reached the post office. He saw the poster from a distance. A Night to Remember, Hogmanay at the Tommel Castle Hotel. Bright colours, cheerful lettering, everything meant to assure outsiders that Lochdu was a place of harmless festivities. Except now someone had scrawled across it in thick black pen, "If you dare drink poison." The words dripped slightly in the damp morning air, giving them an ugliness that made Luggs shrink behind Hamish's leg. Sonsie leapt onto the post office step, sniffed the ink and flicked her tail as if blaming Hamish personally. Inside, the postmistress tried pretending she hadn't seen the vandalism. "Morning, Constable." "Morning," Hamish said. "Did you put up that poster?" "Aye." "And did you see who ruined it?" "No," she said sharply, sorting envelopes with exaggerated focus. "Folk are in a temper, that's all." Hamish stepped back onto the road, feeling the eyes of villagers behind curtains. Everyone knew something. No one would say. Before he could decide what to do next, Blair appeared from around the corner, Anderson trailing behind him like a damp spare part. Blair stopped in front of the vandalised poster, grinning. "Well, Macbeth," he drawled, "now we have threats. Maybe your village is worse than I thought." Hamish rubbed at his neck. "It's probably some cruel joke." "Joke?" Blair barked. "This is a threat to public safety." "Folk here aren't that wicked," Hamish muttered, but the words sounded weak even to him. Blair smirked. "You don't know your own village." Hamish walked off before Blair could crow more. He headed to Patel's shop, Luggs trotting anxiously beside him. Sonsie vanished and reappeared several times, as if stalking rumours. Inside the shop, Mrs. Patel gave Hamish a look he didn't much like. "You seen the poster?" "Aye." "Folk get nasty when money's at stake," she said quietly. "Don't underestimate them." Hamish felt a twist of unease. That was twice in one morning he'd misjudged people. By midday, the minister found Hamish near the Kirk gate, waving a torn scrap of paper. "This was pushed through the door," he said. "Read it." Hamish unfolded the note. "Stop the whiskey before someone dies." The letters were jagged, as if written by an angry or frightened hand. He sighed. "Wonderful." "Do something," the minister urged. "The villagers are already in a state." Hamish knew he'd have to act publicly now. Gossip was one thing, written threats were another. He called a meeting for that evening in the Kirk Hall. Word spread fast, as it always did. By the time the hall filled, wind whistled under the rafters and the smell of damp wool hung in the air. People were restless, shifting on their chairs, muttering darkly. Luggs curled near the door. "Sonsie, you handled it adequately," she said. "Thanks," Hamish muttered. She hesitated. "Just be careful. This is spiralling." Then she left him alone in the echoing hall. Luggs padded over. Pressing against Hamish's leg, Sonsie leapt onto a stack of chairs and stared at him with her pale, unfriendly gaze, as if judging whether he deserved her help at all. Hamish sighed. The clue was small, a girl seeing someone burn labels, but it was more than he'd had yesterday. Someone wasn't just hiding whiskey. Someone was destroying evidence. He stepped outside into the cold night. Clouds sagged low over Lochdu, heavy with more rain or maybe snow. The wind carried distant voices, but no comfort. Tomorrow would bring more trouble. Something was wrong the moment the lights failed. The hotel went first, a dull click and then a sinking darkness that made the guests squeal like hens. A few seconds later, Lochdu itself followed, street lamps blinking out one by one, until the whole village lay in a patchy gloom of peat fires, candles and torches waving up the muddy road. Hamish stood in the station doorway with a lantern that barely pushed the dark aside. Luggs whined at his heel. Sonsie prowled between Hamish's feet, irritated by shadows moving where they shouldn't. Before Hamish could decide whether to check the hill line or the hotel generator, the phone rang with a thin, dying buzz. Macready's curt voice came through. "Our alarms have tripped. I want you here at once. I'm not losing another thing this week. Hamish sighed, grabbed his coat, and walked quickly down the road, the lantern swinging. Above him the sky hung low and black, offering no help. Torches flickered in cottage windows. Two crofters debated loudly about whether the power cut was suspicious, which made Hamish walk faster. He already felt too far behind the village's expectations. By the time he reached the distillery yard, his lantern flame was jumping wildly in the wind. The air smelled of cold stone and malt, sharp enough to sting his nose. The buildings loomed like great silent barns, each one sealed against weather and temptation. But someone was moving. A shadow slipped from one warehouse wall to another, too quick to be drifting smoke. Lugs growled low. Sonsie hissed, tail puffed. Hamish lifted the lantern high. "Police," he called, and his voice echoed off the stone. "Show yourself." The figure bolted. Hamish swore under his breath and chased across the slick cobbles. His lantern threw a wild, bobbing light that made every shadow jump. The youth ahead stumbled, steadied, then tried to cut between two stacks of barrels. Hamish caught him by the collar and shoved him lightly but firmly against a cask. The boy, no older than 20, panted hard, cheeks pink with cold and guilt. "It's me," he gasped. "Robbie, I work here." Hamish kept a grip on his coat. I know who you are. The question is what you're doing sneaking between warehouses like a thief in the night." "I was just checking," Robbie said quickly. "Same as you, Constable. With the alarms down, I thought maybe I could help." Hamish didn't believe that. The boy's eyes darted too much. Sonsie padded forward, sniffing Robbie's boots with sharp suspicion. Hamish reached into the lad's pocket and pulled out a flask. It was half full of whiskey. Not bottled, not cheap. Robbie's shoulders sagged. "Just a wee dram now and then," he muttered. "I'm freezing out here most nights, nobody misses it." "That depends who's looking," Hamish said, "and tonight Macready's looking." Right on cue, the distillery owner stormed into the yard, his own lantern swinging furiously. "What's this?" he demanded. His eyes fell on Robbie. "You. I should have known. You're finished here. Finished." Robbie paled. "Sir, I never touched the Hogmanay cask. Never." Hamish raised a hand. "This is petty pilfering, Macready. Stupid eye. Criminal eye, but it's not the big theft." "A theft is a theft," Macready snapped. "He's out." Robbie looked at the ground, shame rolling off him like fog. Hamish glanced at the dark village behind them. Lochdu had little enough work for its young men. Kicking one out for stealing mouthfuls of whiskey seemed harsh, though Hamish knew better than to explain mercy to Macready, who valued whiskey more than most folk valued their families. "He could repay the loss in work," Hamish said, keeping his voice flat. "Long hours. You get your whiskey back without scandal. The village keeps one of its own employed." Macready scowled. "You ask too much." "You'd rather call Strathbane?" Hamish asked. "Blair will make a parade of it. Press 2. He shrugged lightly. "Up to you." Macready cursed under his breath. "Fine. Work. But if he touches another drop, I'll—" Hamish nodded once. Robbie gulped with relief. A car engine groaned at the gates. Blair arrived, late and pleased with himself. Anderson followed, clutching a notebook as though it might flee. Blair strutted into the yard. "So, another villain caught? Let me guess. Macbeth wants to let him off." Hamish didn't rise to it. Blair looked at Robbie with theatrical disdain. "Soft-hearted Highland nonsense," he scoffed. "No wonder thieves run wild up here." Macready cleared his throat. "This matter is settled." "Settled?" Blair barked. "Since when do distillers make police decisions? Macbeth's got you all dancing the same daft jig." Hamish ignored him. He turned back to Robbie. "What brought you here tonight? Truly?" Robbie hesitated. His fingers twisted the hem of his coat. "I was worried someone might come back," he said finally. "After the Hogmanay cask went missing, I thought the alarms going off was no accident." Blair snorted again. "More superstition from Macbeth's fan club?" Robbie shook his head. "It's not that. It's just, someone asked me about the Hogmanay cask weeks ago, before all this. Asked its number. I didn't think anything of it, but now—" Hamish stepped closer. "Who asked you?" "She spoke like a lady from down south," Robbie said slowly. "Fancy coat. Strong perfume. Sweet at first, then sharp. Kept saying the number mattered." Blair rolled his eyes. "Brilliant description. Could be any tourist." Hamish's mind flicked through the recent arrivals at Tommel Castle. At least 2 women fit Robbie's vague picture. Elegant, southern, perfumed enough to linger in a corridor after passing. "Did she say why she needed the number?" Hamish asked. "No," Robbie said. "But she wasn't one of ours. I'd have remembered." Macready gave the boy a dark look. "If you remember anything else, you tell me first." Robbie bowed his head. "Yes, sir." Blair leaned toward Hamish. "This is your big lead? A perfume bottle with legs?" Hamish didn't bother to answer. He felt the shape of something shifting, though he couldn't name it yet. A woman asking cask numbers, a broken barrel on the shore, rope marks on the pier, lies, small and large, tangling around each other like fishing lines in a storm. The lanterns flickered as a gust swept through the yard. Lugs pressed against Hamish's boot, uneasy. Sonsie stared at the dark between the warehouses, as if expecting someone else to move. Hamish tightened his grip on the lantern. The night felt colder now, and heavier. Whatever waited next would not be simple. He walked out of the yard without a word, the shadows leaning long behind him. Fog pressed over Lochdew like wet wool, thick enough to smother sound and make the street outside the police station feel strangely far away. Inside, the chill crept under the door and settled in the corners. Hamish sat at his desk, shoulders hunched, notes spread in a messy ring, bits of rope, sketches of barrel shards, names half-scribbled, arrows joining things he did not yet understand. Lugs lay on the floor with a long, suffering sigh. Sonsie had claimed the in-tray, tail wrapped neatly around herself, watching Hamish as if waiting for him to admit defeat. He rubbed his forehead. Johnson's panic, Macready's threats, that odd smell in the side room off the hotel corridor, and now this new business with a woman asking about cask numbers. It all tangled together like fishing nets left too long in a shed. He stood abruptly. "Come on," he muttered, pulling on his jacket. Lugs rose at once, alert. Sonsie jumped down, landing with a thud meant to convey disapproval of any plan involving movement. The hotel sat in a fog bank. Its windows glowed faintly, as though the building were embarrassed about its own existence. Inside, the carpet smelled damp again. Hamish moved quietly along the corridor, lantern in hand. Johnson's voice drifted from ahead, raised in weary frustration as he argued with some supplier. Hamish slipped past, keeping footsteps soft. He stopped at the office door. The same ledger he had glimpsed before lay on the desk. With a quick, guilty glance toward the corridor, Hamish stepped inside and opened it. The pages were neat. Too neat. The line describing the Hogmanay cask sat where it had before, but now that Hamish really looked, something was wrong. The value column was smaller than it should be. He traced the line with his finger. Complimentary promotional item. Someone had written it carefully, as if disguising the alteration by politeness alone. He ran down the page. A second entry lay nearly hidden near the bottom. Miscellaneous spirits. Staff use. A sum large enough to hide anything, enough to swallow the cask's worth without blinking. Hamish exhaled slowly. Fraud, not theft. At least not the kind Lochdew was panicking about, and maybe something worse behind it. The door flew open. Johnson stumbled in, red-faced and sweating. "You've no right to be in here," he said, voice cracking. "Police or not, this is private." Hamish held up the ledger. "Who's this for, then? The distillery, the taxman, or Priscilla's father?" Johnson paled. "You don't understand," he whispered. "If we put the real price in, the tax relief disappears. We'd be ruined. The laird expects us to run miracles on scraps. I was fixing the books, not stealing." "Fixing," Hamish repeated. A grand Highland word for lying. Johnson's hands clenched. "It's not theft." Before Hamish could reply, a soft clicking of heels announced Priscilla. She stepped inside without haste, taking in the tableau. Hamish with the ledger raised, Johnson rigid, the room thick with guilt. "What is this?" she asked. Not sharp. Worse. Quiet. Hamish did not speak. He held out the ledger. She scanned the page, her face impossible to read. Johnson swallowed and looked at the carpet. "I only did what was necessary," he said weakly. Priscilla closed the book with a tiny, decisive sound. "You will explain this to my father," she said. "Tonight." Johnson's knees seemed to wobble. "Please, Miss Priscilla, not here." Her tone cut the air like a cold blade. She walked out again, leaving silence in her wake. Hamish set the ledger down, feeling no victory, only awkwardness. He could already imagine the talk. Hamish Macbeth, the village constable who shamed the Halbert and Smythes. Wonderful. Johnson slumped into the chair. "You've ruined me," he murmured. Hamish, uncomfortable with despair of any sort, shifted his weight. "I've not arrested you. Yet." "That's meant to comfort me?" "No." Hamish looked at him. "Just telling you where we stand." He turned to leave, but something fluttered on the floor near the desk, paper tucked between ledger pages, now fallen. Hamish bent, picked it up. A receipt. Small boat rental. The old pier. Dated the very night the Hogmanay cask vanished. Signed not by Johnson, Mrs. Kerr. Hamish stared at the name. Mrs. Kerr, with her prim expression and steady hands, who always spoke as though the hotel ran itself through virtue alone. She had barely featured in any gossip, which in Loch-Dhu meant one thing. She was either terribly dull or hiding something. Johnson noticed Hamish's silence. "What is it?" "Receipt," Hamish said flatly. "A boat hired the night of the theft." Johnson blinked. "I didn't hire any boat." "No," Hamish said. "You didn't." He tucked the receipt into his pocket as Johnson opened and closed his mouth without producing anything helpful. Hamish walked out, boots echoing down the corridor. Fog pressed against the hallway windows like a nosy neighbour. Outside, he stood on the steps a moment, breathing the heavy damp. Luggs nudged his knee. Sonsie stared up at him, eyes pale and unblinking. "I've backed the wrong horses again," Hamish muttered. Fraud in the books. A hidden boat trip. A woman with perfume asking about cask numbers. And now Mrs. Kerr's tidy signature tying the night together in an unexpected knot. Lights flickered across the village as generators tried and failed to start. Somewhere, a crofter shouted at a stubborn engine. A dog barked. The fog absorbed most of it. Hamish tugged his coat tighter and walked toward the station, dogs padding beside him. He felt the weight of the receipt in his pocket, a small thing with too much meaning. The case was turning sideways, not upward or downward, and sideways was where mistakes hid best. The fog followed him down the road, low and quiet. The morning of Hogmanay began with something already wrong. A crackle on the police station line, then silence, just the outside line again, temperamental as ever. Hamish jiggled the receiver, swore under his breath and set it down. Frost clung to the window like a stubborn illness. Even Luggs looked cowed by the cold, ears drooping. Sonsie, contrarily, sprawled across the desk with the smug air of a creature who expected the world to warm itself for her convenience. Hamish pulled on his best jacket, which still made him look lanky and underfed, and stepped outside. The pale winter sun managed only a feeble glow, giving Loch-Dhu the air of a place bracing for disappointment. He trudged toward the Kirk Hall first. Inside, villagers fussed with sprigs of pine and the arrangement of chairs, as if the angle of a trestle table might decide whether the new year would be blessed or cursed. Priscilla stood near the minister, handing him the programme. She looked immaculate and distant as usual. When she finally acknowledged Hamish, it was with a small nod. "Everything must run smoothly," she said. "Loch-Dhu cannot afford another humiliation." Hamish felt that little sting he always did around her, as though she were measuring him and finding him half a foot short. "Aye," he said, "I'll see to it." "You will keep Blair from making a spectacle, won't you?" she added, as though he were a handler of unruly livestock. "I'll try," he said, knowing the promise meant nothing. He escaped to the hotel, where Blair was already prowling about the foyer with Anderson trotting after him like a sycophantic terrier. "Macbeth," Blair barked, "I assume even you can manage crowd control. Try not to lose anything this time." Hamish ignored the jibe. He had arranged something else, something Blair wouldn't understand until it was too late to steal credit. Macready's replacement cask sat by the bar, gleaming slightly even in the dim light. The thistle brand burned low on its side looked almost proud, as if daring anyone to steal it. Villagers and tourists crowded around, whispering. Hamish tapped the cask with a knuckle. "This one's staying in plain sight," he said dryly. "We'll roll it to the bar together. No secret cellars." Blair sneered. "What a performance." "Folk like performances," Hamish said. "Helps them feel safe." The ceremonial rolling began. 2 barmen steadied the cask while Hamish directed the path. Luggs lay under a table, his head on his paws. Sonsie perched on the hearth, tail flicking like a critic unimpressed with the show. As the cask settled into its cradle beside the bar, Johnson fluttered about the edges, pale as old parchment. He glanced nervously toward the cellar door every few seconds, which only strengthened Hamish's resolve. If guilt had a smell, Johnson reeked of it. By 10 o'clock, music drifted from the hall and spilled through the village. The party would stretch between Kirkhall and hotel like a woolen thread, barely holding a patchwork of tempers together. Hamish moved from room to room, nodding at villagers who eyed him with that mix of suspicion and need he knew too well. To them, he was both the man who might save their Hogmanay and the man who had nearly let it sink. Near 11, he pulled aside one trustworthy barman, a quiet fellow named Rory. "Stand by the cellar door," Hamish said. "If anyone tries the keys, give a shout." Rory nodded, eyes sharp. Hamish stationed himself at a side corridor where shadows stretched long. The paired scents of whisky and damp wool filled the air. Lugg stood beside him, tail stiff. Sonsie, as ever inclined to ignore instructions, slunk off to investigate a tray of sausage rolls. At last, footsteps clicked softly. Mrs. Kerr emerged from the staff passage, glancing over her shoulder. She clutched a ring of keys like someone gripping a secret. Hamish stepped out. "Evening, Mrs. Kerr," he said. She jolted, keys clattering. "Constable," she said, too brisk. "Just checking, just routine." "Aye. Folk are keen on routine when they've something to hide." Her jaw tightened. She walked faster. Hamish followed, Lugs keeping pace. The cellar door loomed ahead. She fitted a key, but Rory stepped forward and coughed deliberately. Caught. Still, she pushed through, and Hamish went after her. Inside, lantern light flickered over crates stacked at odd angles. She bent to a cask, Macready's cask, and angled a hidden bottle beneath a tap she had fitted earlier. Whisky dripped in bright, guilty beads. Hamish's voice came out flat. "You sold the first lot already, smuggled by boat, paid off whoever was squeezing Johnson, and all the talk of poison and threats, that was to scare folk away from asking real questions." Mrs. Kerr straightened, cheeks blotchy. "You don't know anything, Macbeth. Johnson's debts were drowning us, Macready breathing down our necks, the laird expecting miracles. Someone had to keep the place running." "By theft? By taking from those who have plenty," she snapped, but the words wilted even as she said them. Hamish felt no triumph, only a weary sort of confirmation. He stepped closer. "It ends tonight." Blair barreled into the cellar a moment later, Anderson puffing behind him. "I knew it!" Blair roared, though he clearly hadn't known anything. "Excellent work. My operation, of course." Mrs. Kerr's shoulders slumped. She dropped the bottle. Hamish snapped the handcuffs on her wrists before Blair could push him aside. He guided her up the stairs, through the corridor where partygoers had begun to gather at the commotion. Whispering spread faster than any official announcement. Mrs. Kerr stared at the floor, and Hamish felt the weight of every watching eye, measuring him as always by who he chose to shame. Priscilla stood near the bar. When Kerr passed, Priscilla looked briefly stricken, then composed herself. She turned to Hamish. "You've saved us and shamed us, Hamish," she said, her voice quiet but edged. Hamish managed a shrug. "Could have been worse. Could have been poison after all." She didn't smile. She never did when he hoped she might. Midnight bells began to gather in the air, muffled by walls and distance. People lifted glasses. The musicians struck a chord. Blair shoved forward to make a grand pronouncement, but no one listened to him. They were watching Hamish leading Mrs. Kerr outside, into the brittle cold, toward the station. Lugs trotted behind. Sonsie darted ahead, tail held like a flag. A victory of sorts. But in Lochdu, victories never felt warm. New Year's Day came in washed out and tired, as though the night before had wrung the colour out of everything. A thin icing of snow clung to the hills above Lochdu, already turning slushy where the sheep had trudged across it. Hamish stood outside the station, blinking against the pale light. Lugs pressed close to his leg, unhappy with the cold, while Sonsie padded out ahead, tail twitching with the faint superiority she reserved for mornings when she felt particularly important. Tourists wandered the street with their cases, leaving behind a trail of muttering. Some laughed about the whisky scandal, making it sound like a comic mishap, the sort of thing they would recount at dinner parties. Others grumbled darkly about Highland corruption, eyeing Hamish as though he had brewed the trouble himself. He bore it with the same weary patience he used for most of life. At the hotel, staff carried boxes through the foyer with the desperate cheerfulness of people trying to pretend nothing had happened. Johnson was nowhere to be seen. Word had already slipped through the village, never officially, of course, that he was being moved to another position elsewhere. A polite way of saying he had been bundled off before anyone with status could complain too loudly. Macready met Hamish in the bar. His big hands folded over a mug of tea he looked insulted to be holding. "It'll do," Macready grunted, meaning the replacement cask now tapped behind the counter. "No charges beyond the fiddling," he admitted. "I'll not drag my distillery through court for this circus, as long as my name stays clean." "Aye," Hamish said. "Folk remember names longer than crimes." Macready gave him a hard, searching look. "You're not as daft as you look." Hamish didn't answer. Compliments from Macready always felt like someone patting a reluctant pony. In Patel's shop later, the stove clanked and the windows steamed while villagers picked over the remains of the drama. A crofter announced loudly, "Trust Macbeth to find the thief." Another sniffed, "Aye, after he had us all under suspicion first." Mrs. Patel folded her arms. "He does his best," she said, though her tone suggested Lochdu's best was rarely enough for her liking. Hamish pretended to examine a packet of tea, but he felt the shift in the room. Their protectiveness had returned, but not fully. It was thinner, stretched over the memory of being accused. He didn't blame them. Villagers forgave slowly, and forgot never. Back at the station, he barely had time to hang his coat before Priscilla appeared in the doorway, elegant in a charcoal winter coat that made the room look shabbier. She stood very straight, as though the place had drafts she refused to acknowledge. "I came to thank you," she said. "You've kept Father's name out of real disgrace." Hamish felt embarrassment creeping up his neck. "Just doing my job." "Yes." She studied him a moment, cool considering. "Perhaps next year we'll try a quieter celebration." The remark sat between them like something fragile and already cracked. She gave a polite nod, then left, and Hamish was struck again by the feeling that she lived in a world where things were arranged in neat lines, while his life sprawled in unpredictable circles. The day wore on slowly, the snow melted into puddles, and the loch turned a dull steel grey. Hamish finally went home, stepping inside his cold kitchen with a sigh. He lit the peat fire, coaxing it to life. Lugs flopped down in front of it with grateful abandon. Sonsie jumped onto the table and examined Hamish with the imperious air of someone checking whether he had solved her problems to her satisfaction. A small parcel sat on the counter. Macready must have sent it by hotel boy. Hamish hadn't heard a knock. He opened it to find a modest bottle of single malt, labelled in Macready's own heavy hand, "For services rendered." Hamish snorted. Trust Macready to put it like a bill. Still, he fetched a glass. It was Hogmanaye's other half, the beginnings of a new year, and even constables deserved a dram after chasing casks instead of villains. He poured an inch and sat at the table. Sonsie immediately poured at the glass, nearly knocking it over. "You've had enough trouble with Whisky this year," Hamish told her. She flicked her tail and walked away, offended. He lifted the glass, letting the scent drift up. It smelled of smoke and something faintly sweet, and it reminded him of old Salies, of nights when Lochdu seemed warmer, before tourists and distillery men and frightened hotel managers tangled up the quiet. He took a sip. Warmth spread mechanically through him, like a stove slow to start. He let his thoughts settle. What would have happened if the theft had stayed buried? Jobs lost. Suspicions festering. Lochdu's name whispered with bitterness instead of amusement. Better the truth came out, even if it had dragged half the village through embarrassment. Lugs gave a snore worthy of a creature twice his size. Sonsie groomed her shoulder, pretending indifference to all human failings. Hamish poured another half measure, small, careful. Outside, distant bells rang in the next village, thin in the cold air. For a moment the house felt too quiet. Hamish realised this would be another year like all the others. Him in the village in him, neither quite satisfied with the arrangement. He raised the glass and murmured, "Here's to not losing any more barrels." Sonsie's ear twitched as if in judgment. Hamish drank the last dram in silence. The second dram sat warm in Hamish's stomach, but not enough to soften the thoughts circling him like midges in summer. The fire snapped softly, sending a faint glow across the kitchen. Sonsie abandoned her grooming to curl on the table, inches from his glass, as if daring it to tip toward her. Lugs shifted in his sleep, paws twitching as though chasing rabbits he would never catch. Hamish leaned back in his chair. The case was closed, more or less. There would still be paperwork for Strathbane, tedious, accusatory paperwork that Blair would enjoy shoving under his nose, but the hard part was done. Mrs. Kerr would face charges, though likely softened by sympathetic lawyers and her own sharp tongue. Johnson, shuffled away in quiet disgrace, would land somewhere far from public money. Macready would crow about the distillery's integrity while selling commemorative bottles to tourists who liked a story with their drink. And Lochdu? Lochdu would move on to its next crisis without missing a beat. He drained the last of his dram and rinsed the glass under the tap. Sonsie leapt down as though insulted he hadn't refilled it. Hamish reached to scratch her head, but she ducked away, offended by the idea of affection not on her terms. The door rattled suddenly with a gust of wind, and Hamish tensed, expecting some delayed New Year's reveller. But when he opened it, only the cold came in, sharp and metallic, carrying the distant crash of waves on the loch's edge. It smelled of the year ahead, still empty enough to fill with trouble. He shut the door firmly and returned to the fire. Lugs opened one eye, saw it wasn't worth moving for, and closed it again. Hamish picked up the parcel wrappings from the table and tossed them into the bin, though his gaze lingered on the label from Macready. For services rendered, as if Hamish had completed a contract rather than stumbling through other people's mistakes. He sat again, letting his elbows drop to the table. The quiet pressed around him, gentler than the fog that often strangled Lochdu but no less persistent. He wondered, briefly and pointlessly, what Priscilla was doing, probably pouring a polite glass of something expensive at the castle, surrounded by people who never had to worry about stray casks rolling into their reputations. He pictured her world, orderly rooms, soft lighting, no cats knocking things over, and felt the usual mixture of longing and resignation. A thump outside made him look up, then another. Hamish rose and went to the window. The loch lay like a black sheet at the edge of his view, reflecting nothing. Snowflakes drifted lazily, too sparse to settle, catching the lantern light outside the station like dust in a beam. He waited. No intruder appeared, just the quiet of a Highland night returning to its business. He stepped back, rubbing his arms. The house felt colder suddenly, though the firewood had burned strong. Perhaps he'd run out of small distractions. Perhaps the case, for all its twists, hadn't given him the one thing he never said aloud. Belonging. Solving crimes didn't make you part of anything. It only made you necessary for a little while. Sonsie padded to the kitchen door, tail swishing. She gave a short, imperious meow, the sort that meant open this, human, or I shall find another way. Hamish obliged, swinging the door just enough for her to slip out. She vanished into the night with the confidence of a queen checking her property boundaries. Lugs woke fully then, standing to watch her go, grumbling deep in his chest. Hamish knelt beside him, rubbing the dog's ears. "She'll come back when she's bored," he said. "She always does." Lugs made a doubtful sound. Hamish rose again, stretching his back. He should have felt triumphant. Instead, he felt the familiar ache of being necessary but uncelebrated, like the peat smoke that warmed the village yet stained every chimney black. He tidied the table without much interest, then settled by the fire with a blanket thrown over his knees. The flames had dipped low, casting a faint orange wash across the room. Outside, the distant bells chimed once, maybe twice, hard to tell through the thick air. Their sound wavered, almost mournful. Hamish let his eyes drift half shut. He imagined Lochdu as it would be tomorrow. Gossip renewed, suspicion softened into jokes, villagers pretending they had always believed in him. A crofter would clap his shoulder. Mrs. Patel would mutter something about not bad for a policeman. Blair would send some smug report to Daviett claiming he had uncovered everything himself. And Hamish would continue as he always did, keeping watch, keeping peace, and keeping his own troubles quiet. Footsteps crunched outside. Hamish stiffened, listening. The steps were light, familiar. Moments later, Sonsie reappeared in the open doorway, bringing a gust of frozen air with her. She hesitated, staring at Hamish as if evaluating whether he deserved her return. Then she strutted inside, shaking snow from her paws with great indignation. "See," Hamish muttered. "Back already." Lugs wagged his tail weakly, relieved. Sonsie leapt onto the arm of the chair and settled there, curling her tail neatly. Hamish reached to stroke her, but she only blinked at him, half-lidded, already dismissing the cold world outside for the warmer one at her convenience. Hamish looked into the fire one last time before the embers fell. The case was closed. The whisky recovered in name if not quantity. The thief caught. The village steadied. And still, he felt the same quiet loneliness settling over him, the same knowledge that he would wake tomorrow to new tempests in teacups, new suspicions, new demands. But Loch Dew was his, even when it turned on him. The loch, the hills, the sharp gossip, the quiet corners, the peat smoke, the stubborn animals, the people who scolded him and needed him in the same breath, they were all tied up in him as tightly as any rope around a drifting cask. He reached for the blanket, pulled it higher, and closed his eyes. Outside, the bells faded into the distance, leaving only the soft crackle of the fire and the faint sound of snow settling on the roof. Hamish took a slow breath, letting the warmth creep through him. The year ahead would bring trouble. It always did. But for this moment, with Lugg snoring and Sonsie watching like a small furry judge, he let himself be still.